Hey, everybody. Welcome to Daniel Davis Deep Dive, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. As the world holds its breath right now, the United States is probably in the final stages of getting ready to launch some sort of retaliatory strike for the deaths of 3 American troops in the Middle East. It's unclear at this point, probably intentionally so from the administration, what the U.S. is going to go after. Are they going to go after the Kataib Hezbollah that is likely the culprit in Iraq and Syria, that where these strikes were conducted? It was actually in Jordan, just all over the Syrian border. Or will they do what many in the Congress and a lot of former and retired generals are saying? We should go after Iran proper and should actually hit Iran and IRGC targets their military inside of Iran and really make them hurt for what has happened here. That's going to be the big question and there's all kinds of ramifications on that. And we have nobody better to break that down with us than Jason Beardsley. Jason is the director of the Veterans Initiatives at Stand Together. He's a former senior advisor in the Trump administration, and we're going to be tapping into that in just a second. And he's also a decorated combat veteran. Jason, welcome back to the show.
Always good to be here. Unfortunately, it's under terrible circumstances, and appreciate you having me on and making this discussion important.
You bet. And you know, I also wish that we could just have happy conversations in here. Maybe we'll do that one of these days and just talk about some of the old times and back when we were both wearing uniforms and all that kind of stuff. A lot of interesting stories, I'm sure. But this is very important. And you've got some insight here that, frankly, I hadn't heard anywhere else. Folks, you're about to get a master class on how these kinds of operations need to be done, how we need to ensure the safety of our troops, ensure our regional security is maintained, and not escalate into a war. Now, if President Biden is wise, and I bet he probably watches our show all the time. I mean, no one's ever said it, and I have no evidence of it, but I bet he does. If he's smart, he will, and he'll be listening to you and probably call you up as soon as this is over. So let's see how that part works out there. But that's a separate issue. But listen, first of all, I just feel like I have to do this. We got to touch a little bit on why we're in this situation here and why these troops were actually killed, because really at the core of it, Iran and all of these groups in the region, they don't fear us, and they're not concerned about what's going to happen, because I think that they don't take us seriously. And let me just show you this one clip that was put together. It's kind of a compilation of some things. Well, it speaks for itself.
I have one word: don't.
What is your message to Hezbollah and its backer, Iran?
Don't.
What's the message to Iran?
Don't.
As President Biden said, just don't.
Exactly. One word. Pretty straightforward.
Very straightforward. We told these terrorists not to attack us, and that should have been enough. And I mean, let's just start right there, Jason. So you're a bad guy, let's say. No offense. But if you were a bad guy and you hear that the president of the United States and the vice president of the United States utter those terrifying words, what are you going to think?
Yeah, I think if you hear that kind of terse language, but you don't suspect that the threat is going to be backed up, or at least significantly backed up, it's actually an invitation to increase your, let's call it, publicity, right? So when I'm sitting in, the bad guys camp, as you say, and I hear that, that's an opportunity to elevate my status internationally amongst other terrorist groups and aligned sort of affiliated groups, and say, when the big bad United States stood up and said this, and we didn't suspect they were going to follow through with any threats, we were able to demonstrate embarrassment in front of the United States. So it actually increases their opportunity for what you've actually seen since October 7th, which is the 150 plus attacks against either our forces, our disposition, our footprint in the Middle East, or shipping concerns. So I think they've actually answered in kind with that. You have to take that threat seriously for it to be effective.
Right. And then the second issue, which we're going to talk about in a little bit more, is that as of earlier today, I think the current total was there had been 165 attacks on U.S. assets in the region since I think the 17th of October, which is when the Israelis actually conducted their ground invasion. That seemed to spark off a lot of support in the region for them and against anybody who was either Israel or supporting Israel, as we were. And yet there have only been 15 really pinprick type one-off strikes, which means that the vast majority of these strikes had no response at all. Even, of course, they didn't hit anything in many of the cases. We shot them down. They missed their target. But the message to the guys who were firing it has to be, cool, let's just keep trying until we succeed. And, of course, they finally did.
Well, and there's a greater context here, too. The Yemenis, particularly the Houthis, which overthrew the government of Yemen in 2014, has been under constant assault and barrage by the U.S.-backed Saudi air campaign for years on end, receiving sort of the bitter end of thousands and thousands of air raids. They've survived that. And this doesn't necessarily wipe them out as much as it upsets them. And it actually forces coalescing around that group. The Houthis have gained power in spite of the years-long campaign to sort of aerial bombard them into non-existence. Now the Israelis are finding the same thing in Gaza. It's very difficult to bomb a guerrilla movement, a sort of a non-state actor into submission. And what you're seeing in our strikes, our retaliatory strikes against the Houthis, is they're not going to be much more effective than they have been in the last 10 years.
Yeah, and that's really that's going to be at the heart of what we're going to talk about here in the bulk of this episode here. But because you're also a veteran, you're associated with Concerned Veterans for America. I want to talk a little bit about the three troopers who have been killed, because I imagine you're probably the same way. That was just anguishing to me. I've been on a couple of television shows talking about a lot of this stuff, and in two of them, they had the parents on before I was, so I had to watch that, and it's just heartbreaking to watch, because this is so predictable, but it doesn't matter when you see that kind of pain. It's just, and it's like a family member, because anyone who's worn the uniform, we all feel that camaraderie ship, especially when you've been into combat. And so I want to take a look at a couple of comments here from Pat Ryder, who's a spokesman for the Pentagon, made yesterday here, and I want to ask your question or opinion about some of the things she said regarding the veterans. Just take a look at the first one.
These are brave Americans, very young, who have volunteered to defend our country and put themselves in harm's way. And so certainly we are reflecting on that anytime we lose one of our teammates, and it highlights the inherent risk that comes with wearing a uniform.
Now, as far as that goes, that's a blanket true statement of literally everyone who volunteers to serve in America. You understand tacitly that you may one day have to lay your life down for your country or for your fellow troopers. That is certainly a given. But what is not a given by anyone who signed up is that they may one day be asked to lay their life down for nothing and for no value. Now, they can't say that. The Pentagon can't say, well, there was no value to America, so they got to make something different up. And here's what Ryder added in a different conversation.
I'm not going to telegraph or forecast any potential response from the United States because of this attack, other than to say there will be a response, and this kind of action will not be tolerated. U.S. forces are in this region for one reason only, and that is to focus on the lasting defeat of ISIS. And so, again, we will do whatever we need to do to protect our forces going forward. But certainly, at the end of the day, we are not looking to engage in a wider conflict.
So we don't want to engage in a wider conflict. We're going to hear the president say that in a minute. But the other thing that's consistent is this whole counter-ISIS mission. In its original comment, CENTCOM actually had a statement where they said that they're talking about this Tower 22. They were describing what it was, and they were just saying it's 350 U.S. Army Air Force personnel deployed to the base to support key functions, including support of the coalition for the lasting defeat of ISIS. They have to add that in there so that they reinforced it. No, they're really there for a reason. Secretary Austin, in his statement, he said that, he was outraged and deeply saddened by the deaths of 3 U.S. service members and the wounding of American troops who were deployed to a site in Northwest Jordan to the Syria border, work for the lasting defeat of ISIS. Again, the identical phrase, which you just keep hearing over and over in all the administration and Pentagon officials. But look, Jason, when you take a look at what's been going on since 2019, when the actual mission that those guys were doing, especially in Syria and Iraq, for the defeat of ISIS, that happened. It was finished. Trump gave them that attainable military objective to take all of the territory that ISIS was holding in Iraq and in Syria. That was finally finished with Mosul and with Raqqa. And I think by the March of 2019 was the date that mission was finished. They should have been withdrawn then. They should have all returned. Instead, none of them returned, and there is no valid mission there. It's myth that they're there for a counter-ISIS mission. So as a veteran, somebody who's fought and somebody who cares a lot about vets, how do you feel when you hear the Pentagon constantly claim that they're doing a mission there that's worthy of their deaths?
Well, let me first say to the families and those who are proud Americans who support this country, they'll go anywhere given the mission. These are young reservists and National Guardsmen who are out at the edge. I'm a Special Forces combatant, so I volunteer to specifically put myself in harm's way. That's not typically the case with someone who's picking up, a little additional work on the side. So we have to first recognize what troops were actually in harm's way here. These are sisters and daughters and brothers and so on. So these are real people. Now, to the lasting defeat of ISIS, one of the complexities here is the Pentagon is kind of conflating terms that we're a military entity. So we do well when it comes to military strategies that affect an opposition military force. What they're talking about here is about trying to tear down an ideology, or let's call it mental stronghold, if you will. And the ISIS sort of ideology is behind this. And what we found in Iraq and what we found in Afghanistan is when we're trying to prosecute a war against a sort of idea, you're never going to have a quote unquote lasting defeat. I think that's some sort of modern gobbledygook, right? An actual defeat comes when your enemy military structure bows down and says, we're done, we quit, we give up the field of battle. You're not going to get that with non-state actors, and it's not going to happen with an ideology. So the Pentagon has placed troops in harm's way, specifically with sort of the notion that we are in the space of rhetorical fighting or ideological fighting. Well, the real truth is the other state tools are better purpose for this. This is diplomatic, it's economic, it's information and intelligence and those type of things that have to be woven together, because when you use a tactical tool, the military, against a non-tactical idea, you're going to be at that a long time. And if you have any questions about this, I know there's audience members who probably, push back on that. You can just look at how COIN did counterinsurgency operations for 20 years in Iraq and 20 years in Afghanistan. Our lasting defeat of Taliban ended when we gave them $700 billion worth of equipment and left them in control of the country we determined that we were going to take them out of control from. And the same thing in Iraq, with the Shias actually penetrating the Iraqi government.
That's just yet another level of problem. But one of the most annoying and aggravating things that I observed during my last combat tour in Afghanistan was when my job required me to literally travel throughout the whole country to visit frontline combat troops to find out, if they needed any additional equipment. I was working for the Rapid Equipping Force. So I was actually sent out there to go to the front line to talk to all these troops to find out, do they need anything that they don't have, that they didn't deploy with, that they need to do their specific job. One of the things that I found so noteworthy, especially from my background, coming from an armor background and working in the cavalry, to where everything in the military that I was taught from a second lieutenant all the way up was you have to have a mission statement, an attainable objective, and an end state. You have to know what you're trying to accomplish, what the logistical requirements are. Do you have enough? And then what are you supposed to accomplish with the resources that you have? That's just standard military stuff. That's just standard even business practice and just good practice, period, in any kind of an endeavor. When I went around to all these troops there, they were, to a man that I ever saw, were always frustrated because there was no attainable military objective against an insurgent group called the Taliban. So they can go and conduct a mission, they can do a patrol, etc., but there's no attainable mission at the end of the day. So you accomplished all of your tactical tasks and nothing had changed. And that is exactly what's been going on here, at least since 2019, throughout both Iraq and Syria, in that there is no attainable military objective. This enduring defeat fiction, because it's an ethereal thing, you can't measure it, you can't touch it, you can't say, all right, well, this battalion will be able to accomplish this, and then all of a sudden they'll be defeated. They don't even have a definition. Ergo, there is no possibility of success. All they can do is sit in these dots in the desert, which we're going to show in a second, and hope they don't get killed. And now that finally 3 of them lost that hope.
You have really nailed it. And that's the problem, is these are not clear military objectives, but we're using clear military operations to try to attain a sort of ambiguous goal. And that puts our troops in harm's way, and we don't take the advantage. Basic military principles is you take advantage against the enemy. It's not advantageous to put 300 guys or girls or service members in a spot in the middle of the desert with surrounded by enemies and then say this is a strategic, key terrain stronghold. That's what the Navy's for. That's what, dropping diplomacy from the air is. We have space-based weapon systems. We have cyber weapon systems. We have diplomacy. We have economic systems. By the way, we're still funding the government in Iraq, which then trickles down the funds to the PMF forces that are Iranian backed that are actually taking shots at our troops. So at the end of the day, the hammer of the military should be matched with the jackhammer of economics. Like cut their ties off, cut the funds off. We have the capability to do that. But the problem is, the same folks that sold the American people on beating, Al-Qaeda and affiliated, affiliates throughout the region, and the same one that sold America on beating the Taliban, lied for 20 years. We didn't beat them. Nobody got fired. Nobody was held accountable. Right. Congress is dodging their responsibility by ducking every single vote they can. During the Trump presidency in 2019, there was a submission by bipartisan legislators to pass the War Powers Resolution Act against Yemen to make sure that the president didn't take us into war there. He vetoed that. They redid it in 2022, another bipartisan thing, and Bernie Sanders pulled it back and said, we don't want to actually take this vote because we want to deal with the administration. Every time Congress has the opportunity to take its role as the legislative body in charge of taking the country to war, you watch them slowly kind of shirk their responsibility and step back, hand it off to the president and say it's his fault. President, meanwhile, stuck in this quandary because all presidents want to expand their own presidential force. They don't want to have to go through Congress, but given the right environment, they would. So what we're seeing here is a lack of accountability in the military, a lack of accountability by politicians, a lack of accountability by the White House. And at the end of the day, who pays the price for that?
Right.
These kids right. On the ground.
Who's the bill payer? It's people like these three who are now dead. And the 30 some odd. Yeah, those, like you said, these are real people. It's not just casualties or three people who died. It's these three individuals right here, these two gals and this guy right here. Obviously, I mean, you just look at them. They look like great people. Like I said, when I was listening to their parents talk about them, it's just breaking my heart because they shouldn't have been killed. They should still be alive. But okay, so I want to kind of shift gears a little bit here. Let's make sure no more die. Let's make sure that these errors that we've identified get acknowledged, and then we can worry about the holding people accountable later, and I will. But for now, let's end this problem here. So now, as I'm going to show you a little clip here from one of the State Department officials. Everybody wants the White House to respond, right? Because they want to say, hey, you harmed our people. You're going to have to pay for it. Now, categorically, I agree with that. The people who actually did this should pay the price. We should kill them. Anyone who had anything to do with killing American troops, I'm 100% on board with that. But we have to make sure we do it the right way so that we don't inadvertently spawn a larger war, which gets more Americans killed for a mission that doesn't even need to be fought. Now, as this State Department spokesman said a couple of days ago, she addressed an issue that everybody's wanting to hear. They want to hear that Iran did this to make it easy to go after them, but she kind of equivocated. Here's what she did say.
Just to follow up, you said Iran was behind the attack. So what does that mean? Have you seen evidence of financing or directing anything specific to this attack? Not just generally, but specifically?
So maybe I need to clarify further from what Lita had mentioned. We know that Iran funds these groups, like Kataib Hezbollah. We know that these IRGC-backed militias are the ones responsible for attacks on our troops in Iraq and Syria. Beyond that, we're doing an intelligence assessment. We don't have. I can't give you today that.
This attack, linking it to Iran.
We just know that Iran funds these groups, like Kataib Hezbollah and other groups that have attacked our forces. But I don't have more to share on.
Matter, you're saying, right?
As a general matter, yes.
So now the question is. If Iran was Iran was associated with it in some degree, whether they actually have the puppet strings like a lot of people want to think, or whether they were just, providing training, ammunition, and resources, then these guys are independent actors or semi-independent actors. I think there's probably some truth to that. But the issue is going to be, what do we do now? Now, when Biden's getting ready to attack, now a lot of people are just thinking, okay, let's go after the IRGC. Let's go after, I actually heard General Kellogg say we should go after the Ayatollah himself, which is the head of state, which is the very active definition of an act of war, which is absurd. Let's hope that they don't do that. But all these talking about, hit this. Nobody's thinking comprehensively about this. You sent me an email a couple of days ago where you listed off a number of things. And that's why I say you're about to get a masterclass on what you need to think about here. One of the first things that you wrote in that is that you said, simultaneously with doing a lot of the things we're going to do, we need to reevaluate the positioning of our troops. Adhering to the basic military principles, we should move them to more strategically advantageous locations. This is taking cover before engaging in a firefight, a tactical repositioning to ensure better defense and effective countermeasures. This kind of strategic redeployment is crucial, especially when considering the modern battlefield dynamics. Now, I have been advocating that we need to withdraw our troops from these just scattered spots. Gary, if you could put that map back up there again a second. You see, when you look at this map, it's like a bunch of red dots just tossed all over the map, and they don't seem to be there in any rhyme or reason. And my argument has been that we need to withdraw the majority of this and put them in places where they can still do some good for the United States, but they won't be vulnerable. Now, you apparently have a slightly different view, but I want you to explain what you mean when you say that the positioning is important.
Sure. Well, as you know, battlefields are very dynamic. They're very fluid. So in key sort of battles, we have to always decide where the key terrain is. Where do we want to be to take advantage of the enemy? Where do we put our forces, our weapon systems, our troops, so that they have a notable advantage over the enemy? Advantage, not a disadvantage. So their current positions put them in places that are disadvantageous, and they have a base of 300 people in the desert. Can provide advantages depending on the circumstances, but that's about logistics and air campaigns and so on. But for the current fight, this strategy against ISIS, if you will, or Houthis or Iranian-backed proxies, advantageously, those troops should have key terrain that is defendable and gives them a chance to strike at the enemy without having to watch their back all the time. This is the equivalent of getting into a gunfight and not seeking cover, right? You don't step out into the middle of the battlefield with no cover and start firing on the enemy unless you're in a near ambush, in which case we're not in a near ambush. We have a deliberate decision-making process. Where will my troops most affect the enemy? And if the answer is sitting in the middle of the desert, you might want to look at your strategic thinkers on this one. It's not a military principle. My suggestion is, look, we have naval vessels, we have strong points, bases that are well defended, have better air defense, better artillery, better response mechanisms, and we can actually move from those bases into positions to interdict and harass the enemy as necessary. But the idea that we would actually take shots at the enemy while we have troops exposed in very, let's call them outpost-like situations, is a really hostile prospect. And by the way, I've been there. I've been a singleton out on the edge of the world when, if the enemy decided to close in my position, I didn't have a lot going other than my wit and charm, and that wasn't going to take me too long. So,
I was going to say on the Iran-Iraq border, we were on a tiny little outpost. It was about 40 of us. And you can imagine most of our time was spent in perimeter security, not doing a lot of other stuff. So yeah, I know how vulnerable it is out there for sure.
Yeah, some people look at that as tripwire diplomacy, right? Meaning if this tripwire is triggered, in other words, if some of our troops are hit, well, then the United States is going to have to bring in the heavy guns, bring in the heavy hitters. My point is we can actually bring in the heavy guns and survive our troops if we position them strategically rather than leave them in disadvantageous positions.
Yeah, I don't need to have Americans killed to have a tripwire. I can just make a decision, a calculated decision based on American national interest and on morality of our country. That I don't need a tripwire, but
right now you're talking policy, you're talking politics, and it takes a national strategy, a grand strategy for those things to be effective, so that you can get to the camera and say, don't. But that don't, without any strategy behind it, it's ineffective.
It's ineffective. Now, one of the things you wrote in that email that raised my eyebrows a little bit, because something I hadn't even considered, and I wonder if you can explain to our viewers why this is important, because on the one hand, it doesn't sound like it's even related, but you say it's very much related, and that is the presidential daily brief. You said that the way that even prior to this, so that the president understood exactly what was going on, and he understood the dynamics, that it maybe should have been something different. Can you explain that?
Sure. Yeah, I was talking about the presidential intelligence, priorities. What do we prioritize? What do I want my intelligence community to focus on? It's like setting Google alerts, right? And if the top two priorities, for example, and this is just taking it right out of the, sort of the air here, but if the top two priorities are Iranian malign proxy influence, then we're watching them. We're spending our money collecting against them. We're developing target lists so that we know how to interdict them. However, if they're not on that top of the list, if they're not a priority for the president, the intelligence communities don't collect on it. Now, just by way of reminder for the audience, the president in 2021, 2022 or 21, I'm not sure which, took the Houthi rebels off the list as a terrorist organization. We have two tools that the United States has: foreign terrorist organization or a specially designated global terrorist organization. Here's the difference. The FTO, the foreign terrorists, if you're associating with them, it's criminal, it's bad. We can take action against you. On the other hand, if you're an SDGT, the globally designated group, then it's basically like we're cutting you off from the United States finances. We delisted the Houthis from the foreign terror organization, put them actually in nowhere until 2024 of January. We relisted them as an SDGT. Now, here's what that means. Long story short, we took away the tools to treat them like a terrorist organization back in 2021. We relisted them as a kind of like cold shoulder of our financing system here in 2024. This is an indication that the priorities of the administration were not on looking at the Houthis as a malign influence organization of Iran, which meant by the time we got in this spat over the Red Sea, we didn't have a target list developed to the robust needs that be required to complete deterrence. Deterrence is about the tools of state. It's our intelligence capacity. It's how do we organize our agencies, that's CIA, NSA, every other tool, so that we're collecting everything we need to know so that when we get to the podium, we know exactly who to hit and where because we've been watching them. On the other hand, if our agencies are focused on other things, their priorities change. And just by listening, you can hear the priorities are things like climate change or diversity or things that end up taking away from the mission itself. That's why we didn't know October 7th was going to happen. And we find ourselves behind the 8 ball.
So there should have been a more robust intelligence organization or focus, if nothing else, so the president is aware of even what's out there, so it's not a surprise to him when something like this pops up. But then the next thing that should have happened, it didn't. Now then we're at the point to where, all right, now then we're going to have to get kinetic because the president definitely, by all accounts, is going to do something big. Certainly compared to these one-off, little warehouse hits that he's done up to this point. The question is going to be what? And you said in this email that you think it's very important that these be intelligence driven and precise. Elaborate, please.
So number one, nesting the strategy. In other words, what is the grand strategy? Who do we try to affect and how? And when we talk about precision, we're talking about interdicting their offensive capabilities. What are they using and from which places? And don't forget, when most people think about striking the enemy, they think in kinetic terms. That's missiles, that's warheads, it's actual material. But we have other means. You remember Stuxnet? I'm sure you do. Stuxnet for the audience was the virus we gave Iranian nuclear facilities a virus that nearly melted down their reactors. And there's different ways: cyber warfare, space-based type warfare. We can interdict the enemy multiple ways. But to do that, our intelligence communities need to provide a robust understanding of how they move money from one place and then operate that money in another place. And right now, again, we'll go back to the Yemenis who have been fighting under aerial bombardment for 10 years, the Houthis, against their own internal conflict. Al-Qaeda is there, ISIS is there, the Yemen government, the old Yemeni government is there, the Saudis are there, and now you have the Houthi rebels. Extremely complex. So if we don't have a developed picture, who are the players, we're not going to be able to strike targets effectively. If we don't layer those strikes with politics, the policies that the administration can cut off the funding. Don't forget, we talked about the funding. The United States is backing the Iraqi government, and we're subsidizing some of the same forces that are shooting at our soldiers, the Iranian-backed PMF forces that are actually lobbing attacks at our soldiers are getting their funding from the Iraqi government. So cut off their funds, look at the policies, understand the intelligence picture, and then you can selectively determine which kinetic strikes layered with cyber, space, economic, warfare, those then could be a lot more effective than what we're seeing when you just emotionally react with a missile strike. By the way, our strikes should be there to decrease their capacity to attack us. These are defending our assets, our soldiers, our people, by creating places that cause them trouble in offending us. Now, that's not easy to do. That's why the intelligence community is built. We spend trillions of dollars on it. So the American people should be able to expect to get some sort of product out of that. And for my money, we're not seeing it.
Yeah, I think that's pretty evident so far. It is because this is what we hope that they do, what they should be doing now. But looking backwards over the last 165 strikes, it doesn't appear that they have been employing that up to this point anyway. Now, the last point I want to talk about here, I think, is one of the least recognized but potentially most significant issues for the United States that I want you to address here a little bit, and that is in terms of our ability to maintain the limitations, to recognize the limitations on our ammunition arsenal. Now, we are, continuing to send a lot of ammunition and weapons to Ukraine. We're trying to get more. We've run out of money there, and we'll see how much further that goes. But there has been literally millions of artillery shells, tens of millions of other kinds of ammunition that have gone up there. Now then, we have literal plane loads by the day going into Israel. We're still trying to send some stuff over to Taiwan. Now then, we've been spending lots of these missiles in the Red Sea. We've been spending lots of other anti-aircraft capability systems in the Middle East to protect all of these little dots on the map that you see there. That's what's happened so far. Right now, we're in this open-ended conflict with the Houthis there in the Red Sea. There's no telling how long that deal's going to go on and how many more missiles we're going to have to expend there. If we get into a war with Iran, this thing could last a long time. Nobody should be under the delusion that a few missiles is going to make Iran back down. And if they escalate and we get into a war, do we have enough ammunition to be able to support all of these things that are ongoing that I just mentioned?
There's always going to be creative solutions in a battle, but the thing that you're talking about, you're an armored guy, cavalry, you've seen it before, is war is expensive, and we've spent a lot of money funding, for example, whether it was Iraq or Afghanistan. We lost a lot of that equipment. It's gone. It's never to be seen of again. And then we funded what was going on in Ukraine to the tune of depleting some of our munitions. And these are not easy supply chains to ramp up. In other words, when you put a TLAM, a Tomahawk missile out, a land-based missile, or when you build a Stinger or Javelin, or when you build things like the howitzers and the shells that go with it, they're not simple production materials. There's an entire line behind that. That's why Raytheon and General Dynamics need time to ramp these up. These are expensive systems. They don't always work in weather battlefield conditions. They're very finicky. American technology has been very much at the forefront of our battlefield enterprise. So that technology takes a long time to spin up. And to keep up with the demand that we saw in a ground war between Russia and Ukraine, we suddenly were dipping into our munitions. And the way we know this is the Pentagon has talked about this. If you listen carefully, what the Pentagon said, they are saying that they are looking at depleted stocks and they're having to resupply themselves. Now, with that in mind, the American people need to remember, I think they're aware of this, but what we're actually facing are potential future conflicts like Taiwan, if China determines to flex their muscles there. How do we continue with allies like Israel? Or what do we do in places like the Red Sea if we have to start launching missiles? This is a very expensive enterprise, and our manufacturing capabilities, as fast as they are always going to go. They're going to fall behind what is needed in a real war. Real wars on the ground are expensive, and we learned that in Ukraine. At the same time, it's easier to offend than defend. Defense, you have to be right 100% of the time. But on offense, you can get lucky. That's why you can throw hundreds and hundreds of drones at a ship. And if one of them sneaks through, that's worth it. On the other hand, if you're on the defense side, you're defending that ship, all of your close-in weapon systems, your surface-to-air missiles, they have to be right every single time. And in battle, that's not even possible. So technology plus supplies make this a developing sort of battlefield, and we're learning about it. And guess who else is learning about it? Iran, who's supplying Russia, who's going to war with Ukraine, and everybody's watching both sides of that conflict, and they're watching the ratcheting up stages of development of warfare. When Ukrainians on the ground are printing on 3D printers fins to put on their grenades so they can drop them from a drone. They've developed and advanced in the battlefield in places that we're still catching up with because we're not on the front lines. We're watching it.
Yeah.
That means we have to get our supply chains right. We have to have the right incentives. But almost to go back to our original point, it's actually easier to put troops in highly defendable locations so that when you are attacked, you have the most advantage over your enemy, as opposed to sitting there in very sparse outposts like you described, waiting for one of 100 drones to slip through and cause damage. That's what happened the other day.
Right. And we just, that really underscores just how super complex all this is. It's not just about launching some TLAMs and sending a message to Tehran. There's so much more involved with it than that. And I certainly hope that the White House has taken advantage of this and thinking about it through the time before they take any action. And it appears that they are. Hopefully, even if it's belatedly, they're starting to do some of that right now. So in the last couple of minutes we have here, I wonder if you can just tell us, if Biden is watching this and he does call you afterwards, what would you tell him that he should do on this case right now? Because he has to respond to something, to this attack in some way. What should he do and what should he not do?
All right. Well, you're going to throw a kinetic at him no matter what. There's no president that's going to walk away from the kinetic. But let's put that aside. Everyone's got that. Hit him in the wallet. Hit them in the wallet. Take the funding that we're flushing, we're making the Iraqis flush with, and start putting constraints on that money because it's leaking through to the Iranian proxies. Next, when you go after these guys, make sure that it's not just kinetic, that you've got other plays in mind. You can Stuxnet them again, you can cyber them, you can do other things, and then have an economic strategy that's available to you to get our commerce shipping through the Red Sea or others, escort the ships, have a strong naval presence, because naval presence allows for flexibility, it allows for advantageous position, mobility. You've got everything you need if you know how to use your Navy right. So when you think about that, that's when you can sidle up to the table and hand over the terse, laconic phrase, don't. Like if you want to be, Clint Eastwood, then be Clint Eastwood. But if you're out there like, Woody Allen trying to be Clint Eastwood, nobody's going to buy it.
Ouch. Okay. Yeah. Well, can't beat that one. Jason, thanks so much for coming on today and giving us this great information here. We can certainly understand why you were hired by the Trump administration. And I hope that the current administration will take some of your advice to heart and will do something that's going to make sense for our country, that's going to keep our troops safe, and is going to limit the exposure we have to the rest of the troops who are out there. Thank you for coming on. And we thank you guys for watching. We ask you to like and subscribe and continue to share this with your friends, because we are unintimidated and uncompromised to continue to bring you all the information you need. And we will see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.